people believe the most important medical decisions are made in operating rooms, under bright lights, with surgeons standing over a table with machines beeping in the background. That's where life changes, right? But sometimes, the decision that changes everything happens somewhere far quieter, behind a desk under fluorescent lighting, on a screen filled with codes instead of faces, and sometimes it's just a stamp. Evelyn Parker had built her entire life around structure. She was a school counselor in a public district, calm, measured, the kind of professional who believed that even in chaos, systems exist to stabilize people. She guided students through anxiety, family instability, academic pressure. She believed in policies, procedures, and frameworks. They weren't cold to her. They were protective. Rules meant fairness. Processes meant order. Institutions meant safety. That belief wasn't abstract. It shaped how she lived. So when her health began to change, she approached it the same way. At first, it was subtle, a heaviness that didn't go away, fatigue that lingered longer than it should, small symptoms that whispered before they shouted. She kept working. She kept showing up, but eventually the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Appointments followed tests, followed appointments, consultations, followed tests. Then came the diagnosis. It was serious. The kind of diagnosis that makes a room feel smaller when you hear it. But it was also treatable. That word mattered. Treatable. Her physicians were clear. There was a specialized treatment. Clinical evidence supported it. Outcomes were strong when administered within a defined time frame. The science was established. The plan was precise. But timing was critical. There was a window. Treatment began within that window. The prognosis was significantly better. Delay reduced effectiveness. Delay increased risk. Delay changed outcomes. Evelyn listened carefully. She asked thoughtful questions. She absorbed everything. There was fear, yes, but there was also clarity. There was a path forward. Then one sentence introduced uncertainty. We need approval from your insurance before we can begin. It sounded routine, administrative, procedural. Nothing alarming. The request was submitted to a government-contracted insurance authority operating under federal agreements and policy mandates. This wasn't a small private office. It was structured, credentialed, official. Its representatives official. Its representatives carried authority rooted in compliance and regulatory alignment. Documentation was thorough. Medical history, diagnostic results, physician statements, evidence-based justification, explicit urgency. Everything was included. But once Evelyn's case entered the system, something shifted in a way she couldn't see. She was no longer Evelyn. She became a file. Her medical history was translated into classification codes. Her symptoms were assigned numeric values. Her risk was categorized according to eligibility criteria. Human urgency became administrative suitability. Inside the approval office, the environment was efficient. Decisions were made under pressure to manage volume and cost. Each approval carried financial implications. Each denial reinforced alignment with guidelines. Efficiency was measurable. Consistency was rewarded. Deviation was discouraged. Her case moved through standardized review. No alarms were triggered. No priority flags were raised. No one highlighted the narrow treatment window. Her doctors had emphasized the system was not built to recognize nuance. It was built to enforce uniformity under current guidelines. Her treatment did not activate priority criteria. That distinction would define everything. Not denied because it was ineffective. Not denied because it was experimental. Not denied because it lacked evidence. Denied because it did not fit within a predefined category of necessity. The approval stamp that mattered most was applied without discussion. No case conference, no medical board review, no consultation with a specialist in her condition. Just a procedural determination, non-essential under current guidelines. The wording was neutral. The effect was not Evelyn received the notice formally. It was polite, professional, structured. It explained that the power requested treatment did not meet criteria for immediate coverage. Alternative pathways were suggested, options that satisfied policy checklists but did not align with the treatment plan her physicians had outlined. There was no mention of her narrowing window, no acknowledgement of progression, risk, no reference to medical urgency, only policy language. She read the letter slowly. Then again, it didn't feel real. She assumed something had been misunderstood, a document missing, a form misfiled. A code entered incorrectly, systems correct mistakes. She believed that's what they are designed to do. But this system did not acknowledge misunderstanding, it acknowledged compliance. Her physicians were frustrated, visibly so, but constrained. They could appeal, they would appeal, they could submit additional documentation, they would document everything again, but appeals followed their own timelines. Medical windows did not adjust to accommodate administrative cycles days. Past her condition did not collapse dramatically. There was no cinematic emergency. Instead, there was something worse. Gradual progression, fatigue deepened, symptoms intensified, energy declined, subtle changes accumulated each day. The system treated as routine processing time carried physical consequences. The insurance authority continued functioning efficiently. Files were processed, metrics were met, denials were categorized and archived. The system did not track what happened next. Its responsibility ended at compliance. Evelyn began to feel something she had never experienced before. Not just fear of illness, but disorientation. She had believed institutions balanced cost with care. She had believed policy and compassion could coexist. Now, she was witnessing how authority could override medicine without appearing cruel. The denial was impersonal, but its impact was deeply personal. Behind the scenes, something else was true, something she did not yet know. The guideline used to deny her treatment had not been updated to reflect recent medical advancements. Clinical standards had evolved, evidence had shifted, but policy revision required committee review, budget justification, and bureaucratic scheduling. In the meantime, outdated standards remained enforceable. What was outdated remained decisive. The system trusted policy more than it trusted judgment, and because the decision had been processed correctly under those guidelines, it was considered valid. Her case was not exceptional, it was procedural. That realization unsettled her more than the denial itself. No one had acted maliciously, no one had raised their voice, no one had broken a rule, and yet her access to time-sensitive care had been quietly blocked. As she prepared to enter the appeals process, she still believed logic would prevail once the urgency was properly understood. She still believed someone, somewhere inside the structure, would see what her doctors saw. What she did not yet understand was that the structure itself was the barrier. The most dangerous decisions are not always made for bad intent. Sometimes they are made with perfect compliance. And sometimes, a single approval stamp can begin to change a future long before anyone realizes what it has taken. This was only the beginning. Evelyn entered the appeals process believing something simple. Once the medical facts were clearly reviewed, the decision would change. That belief felt reasonable. After all, her doctors weren't guessing. They weren't proposing an experimental gamble. They were following established clinical evidence. They had cited studies. They had documented progression risk. They had outlined the treatment window in precise medical terms. This wasn't emotional pleading, it was science. The appeal submission was comprehensive. Updated lab results, detailed physician statements, peer-reviewed references, explicit documentation of urgency. Everything was laid out clearly. Her doctors emphasized one thing repeatedly: delay alters outcomes. They explained that waiting was not neutral. Waiting changed probabilities. Waiting reduced effectiveness. Waiting increased long-term risk. The appeal was filed, and then silence, not rejection, not approval, just process. Inside the insurance authority, the appeal did not go to a specialist in her condition. It went to approval officers trained in interpreting guidelines. That distinction mattered. These officers were not physicians managing patient care. They were policy interpreters ensuring alignment with eligibility frameworks. Their authority did not come from clinical training. It came from regulatory compliance. They were tasked with one responsibility: apply the guidelines consistently. The review acknowledged the medical documentation. It did not dispute the diagnosis. It did not argue that the treatment lacked evidence. Instead, it emphasized something else: policy thresholds, standardized pathways, cost alignment, population level averages. Evelyn's individual risk was evaluated within statistical categories rather than personal urgency. The treatment did not fall within predefined immediate coverage criteria, and because the guidelines were clear, Deviation required exceptional justification. Exceptional meant rare. Rare meant unlikely. The appeal was denied. Again, the language was careful. The response referenced consistency, it referenced fairness across the system. It emphasized adherence to established criteria. It explained that approval outside guidelines could undermine uniform application of policy. It did not reference her narrowing window. It did not mention disease progression. It did not acknowledge time sensitivity. Her doctors were frustrated. One of them explained it bluntly. They are not saying you don't need it. They are saying it doesn't qualify under their rules. The difference sounded technical. The consequence was not. Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Until now, she had believed the system might correct itself. Once it fully understood her case now, she realized the system did understand. It just prioritized something else. The authority reviewing her appeal did not challenge the medical facts, it simply deemed them insufficient to override policy. And because the denial followed procedure, it was considered appropriate. Meanwhile, her condition continued its quiet progression. There were no dramatic hospital scenes, just incremental decline. She woke up more tired. She found simple tasks more draining. Her body felt heavier, slower. Her doctors adjusted supportive care, but they repeated the same warning. The longer the delay, the narrower the window. Evelyn asked if they could override the denial. They couldn't. They could advocate. They could document. They could submit another appeal. But they could not act without authorization. The power dynamic became clear. Physicians were responsible for outcomes. The insurance authority was responsible for compliance. Those responsible for compliance. Those responsible for compliance. Those responsible for procedural. Her classification did not meet criteria for expedited processing. Her case remained in standard queue. What unsettled her most was how normal everything felt on the surface. There was no hostility, no argument, no confrontation. Every communication was polite, professional, structured, but beneath that professionalism was immovability. The guidelines cited in her denial had not been updated to reflect more recent medical advancements. Leading clinical bodies had revised their recommendations. The insurance policy had not caught up. Updating guidelines required committee review, budget analysis, administrative coordination time, and while that process unfolded internally, outdated standards remained enforceable. Her physicians recognized the gap immediately. They had seen similar denials before, cases where policy lagged behind progress, but each instance was treated as isolated, never systemic. Evelyn began researching quietly. She read medical journals. She compared updated recommendations with the language. In her denial letter, the discrepancy was subtle, but real. Clinical evidence supported earlier intervention. Policy thresholds reflected older benchmarks. The difference was measured in weeks, and weeks mattered. She filed another appeal, this time emphasizing that newer medical standards contradicted the guideline used in her denial. The response was restrained. The authority acknowledged evolving practices, but maintained that coverage determinations were based on officially adopted internal policy. Internal policy had not yet been revised. Therefore, the denial stood. It was a perfect circle. Medicine evolved, policy required formal adoption. Until adoption occurred, older standards governed decisions. And until decisions changed, patients waited. Evelyn felt a growing imbalance. Her doctors were bound by ethical obligation to act in her best medical interest. The insurance authority was bound by procedural obligation to follow established criteria. One side measured harm, the other measured alignment. She wasn't angry in a loud way. She was unsettled. The realization was slow, but undeniable. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Appeals existed, but they moved at administrative speed. Urgency existed, but only if defined within policy parameters. Her case did not violate the rules. It simply did not trigger priority. The difference was everything. Weeks passed. Symptoms progressed further. The subtle decline became harder to ignore. Her physicians documented measurable change. They submitted updated assessments. Still, the review cycles continued at standard pace. Evelyn began to understand something difficult. Authority did not need to argue against medicine. It only needed to outlast it. The longer a denial remained in place, the more legitimate it appeared. Time reinforced policy. and policy reinforced itself. She felt suspended in a space where her illness was acknowledged, but not acted upon, recognized, but deprioritized. Each denial carried the same tone, careful, neutral, final. No one raised their voice. No one expressed urgency, but the urgency was real, and it was hers. What Evelyn did not yet realize was that her case was about to expose something much larger than an outdated guideline, because somewhere inside the system, someone had started to notice a pattern, and once patterns become visible, authority becomes vulnerable. This was no longer just an appeal. It was becoming evidence. By the time Evelyn's second appeal was denied, something inside her had shifted. It wasn't shock anymore. It wasn't confusion. It was awareness. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system operating exactly as designed. But what she didn't yet know was that her case had already been shaped long before your human reviewed it, long before anyone read her doctor's words, long before her appeal was even considered. Because inside the insurance authority's infrastructure, there was something else guiding decisions: software automation, classification logic. When Evelyn's file first entered the system, it wasn't just reviewed by people. It was processed by an algorithm, a decision support program, designed years earlier to manage approval volume, cost predictability, and standardized review. It didn't make final decisions alone, but it influenced them. It assigned priority levels. It generated urgency scores. It categorized cases before human eyes ever saw them. And in Evelyn's case, the classification it generated would quietly determine everything that followed. Her condition was coded under a category that suggested stability, not emergency, not imminent risk, stable. The classification wasn't malicious. It wasn't even obviously wrong. It was based on weighting criteria embedded in the software criteria built from older medical benchmarks criteria that had not been recalibrated to reflect newer clinical evidence. Certain symptoms were undervalued, certain risk indicators were averaged across broader populations. Time sensitivity was diluted into statistical modeling. Individually, the discrepancies were subtle. Collectively, they were decisive, because once the system labeled her case as non-urgent, everything downstream adjusted accordingly. Review timelines expanded automatically. Escalation triggers were disabled. Expedite pathways became inaccessible. The algorithm's output became the foundation. Human reviewers saw her case already categorized, already scored, already interpreted, and when software provides a structured assessment, human reviewers often defer to it, not out of laziness, out of trust in the system, trust in validation processes, trust in prior approvals. Evelyn didn't know any of this. All she knew was that every attempt to accelerate her treatment was met with the same explanation. Her case did not meet urgency criteria. She requested expedited review again. Denied. She submitted updated documentation. Acknowledged. Queued. Standard timeline. Meanwhile, her body did not operate on standard timelines. Fatigue became exhaustion. Symptoms that were once manageable began interfering with daily life. She adjusted her schedule at work. She cancelled commitments quietly. She began conserving energy in ways she had never needed to before. Friends asked if she was okay. She said she was managing, but inside, she felt suspended, caught between medical urgency and administrative delay. What made it harder was the language. She wasn't being told no in a harsh way. She was being told not yet, and not yet can be more dangerous than no, because it sounds temporary. But time was the one thing she didn't have unlimited access to inside the insurance authority. Her classification remained unchanged. The longer it stayed that way, the more legitimate it appeared. Each subsequent reviewer saw consistency. The initial algorithmic scoring was reinforced by repeated denials. No one re-examined foundation. They review the documentation against the classification, not the foundation. They review the documentation against the classification against the documentation, and so the cycle continued, but somewhere else inside the system. Something unexpected was happening. A compliance audit was underway, routine technical focused on data, integrity, and system alignment. An analyst reviewing output logs, began cross-checking recent cases against updated medical advisories. It was procedural work, comparative data analysis, verification of software, alignment with policy frameworks. And that's when a pattern emerged. Several cases flagged as non-urgent met revised clinical indicators for time-sensitive intervention. The discrepancy wasn't obvious at first glance. The software hadn't malfunctioned. It had executed exactly as programmed. But the programming reflected older medical standards that had since evolved. The analyst traced the weighting criteria. Certain symptom clusters were assigned lower urgency multipliers than current clinical guidance would recommend. The algorithm had not been recalibrated, not because anyone intended harm, but because recalibrate review funding approval committee, consensus time, and until that process occurred, the existing model remained active. Evelyn's case was one of several affected, but hers stood out because of the documented progression in physician updates. The timestamps told a story: initial classification, non-urgent to appeal, submitted, denial, reinforced progression, documented, to classification, documented, classification unchanged. The algorithm's initial scoring had shaped every subsequent decision, and no one had questioned it inside bureaucratic systems. Automation carries authority. When a system has been validated and approved, its outputs are assumed reliable. Challenging it requires evidence, formal process, risk tolerance. The analyst documented the discrepancy carefully, cross-referenced timestamps, saved output logs, compared policy language with updated clinical standards. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't whistleblowing, it was preservation. Because once something is archived outside active system controls, it cannot be quietly overwritten. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued waiting. Her doctors submitted another update. They emphasized measurable decline. They reiterated that delay was altering prognosis. The response came back consistent. Her classification did not warrant expedited approval. She began to feel something deeper than frustration, isolation. She was fighting something she couldn't see. A label she didn't assign. A score she didn't calculate. A system she didn't design. And yet, that system had defined her urgency. The most unsettling part wasn't that a mistake had been made. It was that the mistake belonged to software no one was empowered to question easily, because questioning it meant admitting systemic vulnerability, and systems built on authority resist vulnerability inside the insurance authority. Discussions began quietly. The analyst raised the discrepancy cautiously, framed it as a technical observation, suggested review. Leadership acknowledged it, then minimized it. Updates to decision support models required structured review cycles. It could not be reactive. One case did not justify systemic recalibration, even if that case represented a narrowing medical window. The message was subtle but clear. Trust the system. Evelyn didn't know that her file had become part of internal debate. She didn't know her classification had been questioned. She only knew that time was passing, and her energy was fading. She had entered the appeals process, believing medicine would outrank policy. Now she was discovering something else. Policy was being enforced by automation, and automation was being protected by authority. What she didn't yet realize was that the preserved data logs, the ones quietly archived, were about to leave internal review. Because external oversight was beginning to take interest in automated denial practices, and once outside eyes began examining patterns, the foundation of authority would start to fracture. Systems built on authority rarely feel threatened from within. They are designed to defend themselves, layers of review, legal language, procedural shields, but they are not built to withstand external scrutiny easily. And that's exactly what was beginning to form. The preserved data, the archived algorithmic outputs, the timestamps, the classification logs did not stay buried inside routine compliance review. Because separate from Evelyn's personal battle, something else was happening. External medical watchdog organizations had begun requesting broader transparency regarding automated denial practices. It wasn't about one patient, it was about patterns. The request was formal, structured, specific. They wanted access to automated classification data across multiple cases. They wanted to examine how urgency scores were being assigned. They wanted to compare denial timelines against updated clinical standards inside the insurance authority. The tone shifted. This was no longer internal housekeeping. This was oversight. Leadership convened meetings. Legal counsel was present. Compliance officers reviewed exposure risk. The algorithm that had operated quietly for years was now under review by people who did not answer to internal performance metrics. That changed everything. Data was prepared carefully, contextual explanations were drafted, language was refined, the narrative emphasized policy alignment and procedural integrity, but oversight bodies do not evaluate intent. They evaluated impact. When external reviewers began analyzing case patterns, discrepancies surfaced quickly. Patients flagged as non-urgent under internal classification models met criteria for time-sensitive intervention under updated medical standards. Evelyn's case was among them. Her documentation illustrated measurable progression during administrative delay. Her treatment request aligned with evolving clinical recommendations, yet her urgency score remained unchanged for weeks. When reviewers placed her timeline next to disease progression benchmarks, the contrast was stark. Delay had measurable consequence. The algorithm had not malfunctioned. It had simply not evolved. The oversight report identified a systemic gap. Decision support software relied on outdated weighting criteria. No formal mechanism required immediate recalibration. When clinical standards advanced, authority had assumed continuity. Medicine had moved forward. The gap existed in that space. Inside the insurance authority, reactions were controlled, but tense. Publicly, cooperation was emphasized. Privately, risk calculations intensified. Admitting error meant potential liability. Denying error meant contradicting documented evidence. Leadership framed the issue carefully. They described it as a transitional alignment challenge. They emphasized that guidelines require structured adoption processes. They noted that internal policy revision cycles take time, but oversight reviewers focused on one principle. When delay increases patient risk, process speed matters. Evelyn still did not know the full scope of what was unfolding behind the scenes. She only knew that after months of resistance, something felt different. Her latest physician update had not been met with immediate denial. Instead, she received notice that her case was under independent review. The language was subtle, but it carried weight. Independent. That word meant someone outside the original structure was now looking at her file. Her doctor sensed it too. There was a new tone in communications, less certainty, more caution inside the organization. Confidence in the algorithm began to fracture. When authority is questioned publicly, internal behavior changes quickly. Manual review committees were discussed. Temporary override pathways were debated. Some approval officers expressed frustration privately. They had followed policy. They had applied guidelines correctly. Now, the foundation of those guidelines was being challenged. The analyst who had preserved the original data was formally interviewed. Their documentation corroborated the oversight findings. Timestamp logs confirmed that classification scoring had remained static despite updated clinical advisories. That confirmation eliminated plausible deniability. The discrepancy was no longer theoretical. It was documented. Oversight bodies prepared formal recommendations. Immediate recalibration of urgency weighting, mandatory human review for time-sensitive classifications, temporary suspension of automated priority downgrades. These were not suggestions. They were conditions tied to regulatory compliance. Authority, once shielded by automation, was now obligated to adjust. For Evelyn, the emotional experience was complicated. Relief did not arrive instantly, because exposure does not reverse time. It only changes trajectory. Her body had continued to change during the months of delay. Symptoms were no longer subtle. Daily life required adaptation. Energy was rationed carefully. Every new review notification carried both hope and resentment. Hope that treatment might finally begin. Resentment that it had taken external intervention to reach this point. Inside leadership, meetings, strategic decisions were made. Approve immediately and acknowledge systemic failure. Delay for and risk public reporting that could expand scrutiny beyond a single case. Reputation was at stake. Federal contracts were at stake. Institutional credibility was at stake. For the first time, urgency existed inside the system itself. But it was a different kind of urgency. not medical, reputational. When oversight enters a structure built on automation and authority, power dynamics shift rapidly. Decisions that once felt routine become high-risk. Language becomes cautious. Files once ignored become priority. Evelyn's case moved to the top of a review queue, not because her condition had changed, but because the environment had. And as external reviewers finalized their findings, the insurance authority faced a defining moment: defend the denial and risk broader exposure, or approve the treatment and acknowledge that the original decision had been built on outdated logic. For months, but authority had relied on repetition to legitimize denial. Now repetition was no longer protection. Evidence had entered the room, and evidence does not respond to procedural tone. It responds to accuracy. Evelyn waited. Again, the silence felt heavier, because the system was no longer certain of itself. And when a system loses certainty, correction becomes possible. The approval came quietly, no dramatic phone call, no apology, no admission of fault, just a formal notice, structured language, revised determination, coverage, authorized under updated review standards. The same system that had once stamped her treatment as non-essential had now reversed its position on paper. It looked procedural routine, as if this outcome had always been a possibility. But Evelyn understood something the document did not say. This approval was not the result of new medical discovery. It was the result of scrutiny oversight had forced. Recalibration policy had been updated. The algorithm had been adjusted. Human review had been inserted where automation once dominated. Authority had shifted because it had to. Her physicians moved quickly. There was no celebration in the room, only urgency. They reviewed her latest results carefully. The treatment plan required adjustment now. Progression had occurred. Subtle changes from earlier weeks were no longer subtle. What had once been straightforward was now more complex. The peel therapy would proceed, but the projected outcomes were no longer identical to what they had been months earlier. Time had altered probability. Evelyn absorbed this calmly. She had lived in uncertainty for long enough that shock felt muted. There was relief. Yes, but it was layered with something heavier: awareness. She understood that the approval did not erase the delay. It did not restore the weeks lost to processing cycles. It did not rewind the physical changes that had occurred while she waited. Justice, when it finally arrived, felt incomplete. Inside the insurance authority, internal adjustments continued. Temporary override committees became permanent review panels. Algorithmic recalibration was documented formally. Age in policy manuals shifted. Urgency safeguards were added. Training sessions reminded approval officers that automation was advisory, not absolute. But none of those revisions referenced Evelyn directly. Her case became anonymized within procedural reform summaries. An example: a data point A, lesson not a name. The analyst who had preserved the original logs returned to routine duties. Their actions were never publicly acknowledged. The system absorbed the correction without recognizing dissent. That was part of its stability. Institutions evolve quietly when necessary. They rarely spotlight the individuals who force adaptation. Public communication from the authority emphasized commitment to continuous improvement. It framed recalibration as evolution rather than error. There was no admission of harm, only affirmation of progress. From a compliance standpoint, the issue had been resolved. From a human standpoint, it was more complicated. Evelyn began. Treatment sessions were exhausting. Side effects were real. Recovery was uncertain. Her doctors remained hopeful, but measured. They could not guarantee what the earlier timeline might have provided. They could only move forward with what remained. Friends and colleagues expressed relief. They saw approval as victory. And in some ways, it was, but Evelyn felt something quieter. She no longer viewed institutions the same way. She no longer assumed that policy aligned naturally with care. She had witnessed how easily outdated guidelines could persist, how automation could inherit authority, how compliance could overshadow consequence. The most unsettling part was not that the system had made a mistake. It was that the mistake had been normalized, repeated, defended, converted into precedent until oversight forced re-evaluation. She thought often about the classification label that had once defined her case. Non-urgent, non-essential words assigned by software words, reinforced by policy words, that had quietly delayed care. She wondered how many others carried similar labels without ever knowing how many never discovered that the guideline used to deny them had already been contradicted by evolving evidence. How many accepted delay as inevitability, not because it was medically necessary, but because it was administratively convenient. The approval stamp that once blocked her treatment now authorized it. The stamp looked identical. Same format, same structure, same authority only. The context had changed, power had not disappeared. It had adjusted. Evelyn returned to work gradually. Her energy was different. Her perspective was sharper. When students came to her overwhelmed by bureaucratic obstacles, financial aid delays, institutional paperwork, system barriers, she listened differently. She no longer spoke about process as something inherently protective. She spoke about advocacy, documentation, persistence. She understood now that systems do not feel urgency. People do. Systems measure compliance. People measure consequence. And sometimes those measurements collide. The oversight findings eventually entered official record. They did not accuse individuals of cruelty. They did not describe villains. They documented structural misalignment, automation, relying on outdated criteria, policy lagging behind medical advancement, delay, increasing measurable patient risk, clinical language restrained, precise, but behind that restraint was truth. The system had functioned exactly as designed, and that design had allowed harm to occur without anyone technically breaking a rule. That realization stayed with her, because it meant the danger was not in bad actors. It was in unquestioned structure. Evelyn did not seek public confrontation. She did not file lawsuits. She did not demand apology. What she wanted was simpler acknowledgement. That time matters acknowledgement. That urgency cannot be averaged. Acknowledgement that care delayed is often care diminished. Some decisions are reversed, but not all consequences are. As months passed, the intensity of oversight faded. Public attention moved elsewhere. The insurance authority resumed routine operations under revised safeguards. The algorithm remained in place, but recalibrated. Manual review existed, but within limits. Efficiency still mattered. Cost still influenced structure. The system had learned, but it had not transformed completely. Evelyn understood that to reform correct specific failures. It does not eliminate risk. The final question lingered quietly, not in policy meetings, not in oversight reports, but in lived experience. How many patients never receive approval at all? How many windows close without external scrutiny? How many cases never intersect with evidence at the right moment? Her story did not end in triumph. It did not end in tragedy. It ended in awareness. A single approval stamp had once reduced her future to a classification. Another stamp had restored access, but neither stamp could return what delay had altered. That truth remained.